I knew he was watching. And the craziest part? I liked it. The first time I noticed the camera in my room, it should have scared me. But it didn't. Instead, I felt this strange rush, like excitement bubbling under my skin. It happened completely by accident. I was fixing my bed, fluffing the pillows like I always did, when something caught my eye. A tiny black lens, barely visible, hidden between a stack of books on my shelf. My heart skipped a beat, not out of fear, but something else. I froze for a second, staring at it, my mind racing. Could it be a joke? Maybe one of my friends had pulled a prank on me? But no, this wasn't some dumb teenage joke. This was something else, something deliberate. And then it hit me. Owen, my stepdad. He was 52, always so calm, so composed. The kind of man who blended into the background, like a piece of furniture you never paid attention to until you did. But I remembered the way his eyes would sometimes linger on me just a little too long. The way his gaze would drop to my hips when he thought I wasn't looking. And suddenly, it all made sense. A few weeks ago, he told my mom he was upgrading the security system in the house. At the time, I didn't think twice about it. But now I realized, who installs a security camera in their stepdaughter's bedroom? I could have told my mom. I could have ripped the camera off the shelf, thrown it in his face, and demanded answers. But I didn't. Instead, I left it there. And that's when things got really interesting. That night, when I got home from my friend's house, I picked out the shortest, tightest dress I owned. Bright red, clinging to my body in all the right places. I knew he was watching as I stood in front of the mirror, letting the straps of my dress slip slowly off my shoulders. I brushed my hair, leaning forward just enough to give the camera a perfect view of my curves. My heart pounded in my chest, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the thrill. This was wrong. I knew it. But with every passing second, I felt myself getting pulled deeper into the game. I wanted to see how far I could push him, how long he could pretend he wasn't doing exactly what I knew he was doing. I wanted to know if he'd break, if he'd admit what he was really thinking when his eyes lingered on me at breakfast or when we were alone in the house. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I didn't even bother putting on a robe. I slipped into the kitchen in my lightest, most revealing pajama set. The fabric barely covered my thighs, and the cool morning air sent shivers up my spine. But it wasn't the cold that made my heart race. Owen was there, sitting at the table with his usual cup of coffee, reading the paper like everything was normal. But it wasn't. Not anymore. His eyes lifted, and when they met mine, there was something different in them. A flicker of awareness. He knew that I knew. His gaze didn't drop immediately like it usually did. Instead, it held on me for just a second too long, trailing down my body before snapping back to his coffee cup. And then, with a calmness that sent chills through me, he said, "Cassie, you look different this morning." Different. That word hung in the air between us, thick and heavy with meaning. I didn't respond. I just smiled, poured myself some coffee, and sat down across from him, feeling the tension crackle like static electricity in the room. And in that moment, I realized, this was only the beginning. What happened next? Well, let's just say, things got even more complicated. And trust me, you're going to want to hear the rest of this. The next morning, I woke up with a strange feeling. The sunlight crept through my curtains, casting soft patterns on the walls, but instead of the usual calm that mornings brought, there was something different in the air, a tension I couldn't shake. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of what I discovered the night before. The camera. It was still there, quietly recording, watching me even as I slept. I could have ripped it off the shelf the moment I saw it. I could have confronted Owen, maybe even told my mom. But I didn't. Instead, I decided to play along. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the thrill, the danger, or maybe it was the curiosity to see how far he'd go. But whatever it was, it pulled me in deeper. I slipped out of bed, deliberately choosing the thinnest tank top I owned. No bra underneath, paired it with a pair of shorts so short they barely covered me. I could feel the cool morning air against my skin as I made my way downstairs. The house was quiet except for the faint sound of sizzling from the kitchen. Owen was there, standing by the stove, flipping pancakes like it was just another ordinary day. But it wasn't. Not anymore. I walked in, acting casual, pretending I didn't know his secret. But every step felt like I was walking on a tightrope. I could feel his eyes on me before I even reached the counter. That split-second pause in his movements gave him away. His gaze flicked over me, lingering just a moment longer than it should have, before he quickly turned back to the stove. But I saw it. I felt it. "Morning," I said softly, pouring myself a cup of coffee, the mug warm in my hands. "Morning, Cassie," he replied, his voice steady, too steady. But I caught the faintest tremor beneath it. I sat at the table across from him, pretending to sip my coffee, though my heart was pounding too hard to really taste anything. The silence between us stretched, thick and heavy. He didn't look at me again, but he didn't need to. I knew he was aware of every move I made. After breakfast, I left the house for my classes, but even as I walked across campus, my mind wasn't on lectures or assignments. It was on him. I kept wondering what he was doing back at home. Was he watching the footage from last night? Was he thinking about me the way I was thinking about him? By the time I got home, the sun was starting to set. I pushed open the front door, and the familiar creak echoed through the quiet house. I knew Owen was there somewhere, but the house felt different. The air felt charged. I climbed the stairs slowly, my heart beating in my chest like a drum. When I reached my room, I left the door half open, just enough. I pulled off my sweater, letting it fall carelessly to the floor, then unbuttoned my jeans slowly, savoring the moment. I knew he was watching. Maybe through the camera, maybe from the hallway, but I could feel his eyes on me. I stood in front of the mirror, running my fingers through my hair, letting it fall over my shoulders. My pulse was racing, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to. I changed into a soft, loose shirt that slid over my skin like a whisper and a pair of shorts that felt more like an afterthought. When I finally went back downstairs, he was there, in the living room, sitting on the couch, pretending to watch TV. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched slightly when I walked in. I sat down on the other end of the couch, the space between us too small, too close. The room felt suffocatingly quiet, except for the soft murmur of whatever show he had on. But neither of us was paying attention. I stretched my legs out casually, letting my foot brush against his calf. It was subtle, almost innocent, but the way he stiffened told me he felt it too. He didn't move away. He didn't say anything. But I could feel his gaze burning into me from the corner of his eye. The night dragged on like that, silent, heavy, electric. I could almost hear his thoughts, feel the struggle in the way his hands gripped the edge of the couch, as if holding on for control. But he never said a word, and neither did I. When I finally went back to my room, I closed the door softly behind me and leaned against it, my heart pounding. I stared at the camera, its tiny red light blinking in the dark. I should have been terrified, but all I felt was heat, curiosity, and something I didn't dare name. This wasn't over. Not even close. The next day followed the same rhythm. The tension between us grew thicker, harder to ignore. Every glance, every accidental touch, felt like a spark in a dry forest, ready to ignite. I found myself looking forward to seeing him, wondering how far we could push this silent game before one of us broke. That evening, after dinner, I caught him in the hallway. We both paused, the narrow space between us amplifying the tension. His eyes met mine, and for a split second, the air was too thick to breathe. "Good night, Cassie," he said finally, his voice lower than usual. "Good night," I whispered, but I didn't move. Neither did he. For a moment, we just stood there. The invisible line between us stretched so thin it felt like it could snap at any second. But it didn't. Not yet. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder, how much longer could we keep playing this game before everything spiraled out of control? Little did I know, things were about to get even more complicated. A few days after I discovered the camera, my mom left for a business trip. It wasn't unusual for her to travel, but this time, it felt different. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, the house felt heavier, quieter, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. It was just me and Owen now, alone. And I knew this was our chance to test the limits of this game we had started. That evening, as if on cue, Owen suggested we watch a movie. His voice was casual, like it was the most normal thing in the world, but I felt the tension simmering beneath his words. I agreed, pretending I didn't feel the electric charge in the air between us. But I did, every second of it. I changed into something deliberately casual, a tank top just loose enough to slip off one shoulder, and soft shorts that barely covered me. When I walked into the living room, Owen was already on the couch, the TV remote in his hand, flipping through movie options. I settled next to him, close enough to feel the warmth of his body, but far enough to keep the tension sharp. As the movie started, I let my body relax into the cushions, occasionally shifting so that my arm or leg would accidentally brush against his. Each touch was subtle, but the way his body stiffened told me he felt it too. I could hear his breathing change, becoming just a little heavier, a little less controlled. I let my hair fall over my shoulder, exposing the curve of my neck, knowing his eyes would follow. And they did. I could feel his gaze like a physical touch on my skin. "Interesting movie, huh?" I murmured, my voice soft and teasing as I turned my head slightly to meet his eyes. "Very," he replied, his voice low, rougher than usual. But we both knew he wasn't talking about the movie. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the tension between us stretching thin like a rubber band about to snap. But then he looked away, focusing back on the screen, pretending like nothing had happened. But something had, and we both knew it. The next day, he offered to take me to the store. It was such a mundane thing, but the air between us was anything but ordinary. The silence in the car was suffocating. Neither of us spoke, but I could feel his eyes flicking to me every so often as I stared out the window. I wore a short summer dress, light and airy, the hem brushing against my thighs every time I shifted in my seat. When we got out of the car, I noticed the way his eyes trailed down my legs before he quickly looked away, pretending to focus on something else. But he saw, and I made sure he did. In the store, I moved slowly through the aisles, picking up random items, feeling his presence behind me with every step I took. When we reached the checkout, he stood closer than necessary, his hand grazing the small of my back as we moved forward in line. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. On the way back home, the silence was heavier than before. I could feel the tension building with every mile, like we were driving straight into something neither of us could stop. That evening, after dinner, I decided to push things further. I took a long, hot shower, letting the steam fog up the mirrors. My heart pounded in my chest the whole time, but I didn't hesitate. I wrapped myself in the thinnest towel I could find, barely enough to cover me, and stepped out into the hallway. I knew he was home. I knew he could see me if he wanted to, and I wanted him to. As I walked past his room, I slowed down, pretending to adjust the towel. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. His door was slightly ajar, just enough for him to watch. My pulse raced, but I kept my pace steady, acting like I didn't notice. But I knew he was there. I could feel his eyes on me, tracing every inch of my exposed skin as I walked back to my room. These days were becoming more dangerous. We both knew we were approaching a point from which there would be no return. Evening crept in faster than I expected, dragging with it a weight that settled deep in my chest. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't just fill the space, it presses against you. Mom had texted earlier, saying she'd be late at work again. That left just me and Owen. Alone. The tension between us had grown unbearable over the past few days, like a taut wire ready to snap with the slightest touch. I stood in front of my mirror, staring at my reflection as I slipped into a thin, almost transparent nightgown. The fabric clung to my skin, delicate and soft, leaving little to the imagination. My heart pounded in my chest, not from fear, but from anticipation. I knew exactly what I was doing, and I knew he'd notice. I could feel the house holding its breath as I stepped out of my room and made my way downstairs. The cool air brushed against my exposed skin, sending a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. The wooden stairs creaked softly beneath my feet, but I didn't hesitate. I wanted him to hear me coming. When I reached the kitchen, Owen was there, sitting at the table, a glass of something dark in his hand. His eyes met mine the moment I walked in, but this time, he didn't look away. Not like before. His gaze drifted from my face to my bare shoulders, down the curves of my body outlined by the thin fabric of my nightgown. I felt the heat of his eyes like a physical touch, and my skin tingled under his stare. "Can't sleep?" His voice was low, rough, but there was something else there now, something darker. I shook my head slowly, stepping closer, my bare feet cool against the tiled floor. "No," I whispered, my voice soft, deliberate. I was testing him, pushing him, and I could see in his eyes that he knew it. I moved to the counter, pouring myself a glass of water, feeling his gaze on me the entire time. I could barely breathe, the air between us thick with unspoken words and desires we both knew we shouldn't have. When I turned around, he was still watching me, his expression unreadable but his eyes betraying him. I could see the struggle there, the battle between what he knew was right and what he wanted. I walked over to the table, every step measured, deliberate. I sat down next to him, closer than I needed to be, close enough to feel the warmth of his body radiating toward me. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was heavy, charged, like a storm waiting to break. For a moment, neither of us moved. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, marking the seconds as they stretched into an eternity. Then his hand moved, slowly, almost hesitantly, resting on the table between us. I let my fingers drift toward his, the tips just barely brushing against his skin. The contact was electric. A jolt shot through me, and I saw him flinch slightly, but he didn't pull away. "Cassie," he whispered, his voice barely audible, like speaking louder would break whatever fragile barrier was left between us. "Do you understand what we're doing?" I met his gaze, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The answer was in the way I leaned closer, the way our breaths mingled in the small space between us. The heat between us was suffocating, the pull undeniable. His eyes searched mine, looking for something, maybe permission, maybe a reason to stop. But he didn't find either. I leaned in even closer, our faces just inches apart now. I could feel his breath on my lips, warm and shaky. We were right on the edge. But then, just when I thought he would close the distance, he pulled back. Suddenly, like he'd been burned. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, the sound harsh in the quiet room. His eyes were wild, filled with something between desire and regret. "I can't," he muttered, running a hand through his hair, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. But I saw it in his eyes. He didn't want to stop. He just couldn't handle what it meant if we didn't. He stared at me for a long moment, like he was trying to memorize the way I looked in that moment, before finally turning and walking out of the kitchen. His footsteps echoed down the hall, leaving me alone with the deafening sound of my heartbeat. I sat there, staring at the empty doorway where he had just been, my body still humming from the almost touch, the almost kiss. My skin was on fire, my mind racing. I should have felt relief. I should have been grateful that he walked away. But all I felt was the burning need for more. I knew we had crossed a line tonight, even if nothing physical happened. The tension, the looks, the touches, it was all too much now. This wasn't something we could just ignore anymore. I went back upstairs, my legs shaky beneath me, and collapsed onto my bed. I stared at the ceiling, the events of the night replaying over and over in my mind. The camera's tiny red light blinked in the corner of my room, a constant reminder of how far things had gone. But I knew one thing for sure, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. We were standing on the edge of something dangerous. And tomorrow, I was certain of one thing. We would cross it. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of heaviness in my chest. The air in the house felt thicker, heavier, as if even the walls knew we were balancing on a knife's edge. The memory of last night clung to me like a second skin, the tension, the near miss, the way Owen's breath felt against my skin when we were this close to crossing the line. But we hadn't. Not yet. I spent most of the day moving through the house in a haze, pretending everything was normal, but it wasn't. Owen and I barely spoke. When we passed each other in the hallway, the tension was palpable, like static electricity waiting to spark. His eyes were heavier, darker, and I could see the conflict brewing inside him. But I felt it too. By late afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to feel in control again. So, I pushed. I wore the thinnest, tightest tank top I could find, one that barely covered me, paired with shorts that felt like an afterthought. I knew what I was doing. I wanted him to notice. And I knew he would. When evening rolled around, Mom texted to say she'd be working late again. My heart skipped a beat when I read the message. This was it, the moment we both knew was coming. The moment we couldn't avoid anymore. I waited until the house was cloaked in shadows, the only light coming from the dim lamp in the living room. I could hear the soft hum of the TV, but I knew Owen wasn't really watching it. He was waiting. For me. I took a deep breath, feeling my pulse quicken as I stepped out of my room and made my way downstairs. The floor felt cold under my bare feet, but my skin was already warm, anticipation thrumming in my veins like a second heartbeat. When I entered the living room, Owen was sitting on the couch, his eyes fixed on the TV, but I could see the tension in his posture, the way his jaw was clenched, his shoulders stiff. But when he finally looked at me, he didn't look away. His gaze dragged over me, slow and deliberate, lingering on the bare skin of my legs, the curve of my waist, the rise and fall of my chest beneath the thin fabric. It was a look that said everything he hadn't dared to say out loud. I felt my breath hitch in my throat, but I didn't stop. I stepped closer, each movement measured, deliberate, until I was standing right in front of him. Our eyes met, and the room felt like it shrank around us, the walls pressing in, the air crackling with something dangerous, something undeniable. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. I reached out, my hand trembling just slightly as I placed it on his shoulder. The contact was electric, a jolt that shot straight through me. His breath hitched, his eyes darkening as he looked up at me. For a moment, we just stayed like that, frozen, teetering on the edge of something we couldn't take back. And then I leaned in. I could feel his breath against my skin, warm and uneven, as our faces hovered inches apart. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. His hand slowly lifted, reaching for me, and I knew this was it. We were about to cross the line. But then, just as his fingers brushed against my waist, the front door slammed open. What the hell is going on here? Mom's voice cut through the room like a blade. We both froze, the spell between us shattering into a million pieces. I jerked back, my hand falling from his shoulder as if I'd been burned. Owen's face went pale, his eyes wide with panic. I turned toward the doorway, my heart dropping into my stomach. Mom stood there, her eyes darting between us, taking in the scene, the way I was dressed, the distance, or lack thereof, between us, the tension that still lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. She knew. She didn't need us to explain. Mom, I started, my voice shaky, it's not what it looks like. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew how hollow they sounded. It was exactly what it looked like. She didn't say another word. Her face hardened, and without a glance back, she turned and stormed out of the room, the door slamming behind her so hard the walls seemed to shake. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was my ragged breathing and the faint hum of the TV in the background. I stood there, staring at the empty doorway, my mind spinning, my heart still pounding in my chest. When I finally turned to look at Owen, he was already on his feet, his face pale and drawn. His eyes met mine, and for the first time in days, I saw something other than desire in them. Regret. We need to talk, he whispered, but his voice was distant, hollow. I nodded, but I didn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my mind a swirl of emotions I couldn't even begin to untangle. I'd spent days chasing this moment, playing with fire, and now that we'd finally gotten burned, I didn't know how to put out the flames. Owen took a step toward me, but I flinched back instinctively. The look on his face, hurt, guilt, maybe even fear, cut deeper than I expected. This was a mistake, I whispered, more to myself than to him. It was always a mistake. He didn't argue. He didn't try to justify it. He just stood there, staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. And maybe he was. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, my steps heavy, my mind numb. I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle over me like a thick blanket. When I reached my room, I shut the door behind me and leaned against it, my heart still racing. The camera was still there, the tiny red light blinking in the corner, a silent witness to everything we'd done, everything we'd almost done. I stared at it for a long moment before finally walking over and pulling it off the shelf. I held it in my hands, feeling the cool metal against my skin, and for the first time since this all started, I felt nothing. I knew now, with crystal clarity, that this was wrong. It had always been wrong. And no matter how thrilling it felt in the moment, no matter how intoxicating the danger was, it wasn't worth it. It would never be worth it. I took a deep breath, my fingers tightening around the camera, and then I threw it into the trash. The sound of it hitting the bottom of the bin echoed in the quiet room, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, letting the silence wash over me. The house was still now, the tension that had filled every corner of it finally dissipating. But in its place was something else, a hollow emptiness that I knew would take a long time to fill. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know how Mom would react, or what Owen would do. But one thing was clear. This was over, and it should have never started in the first place.